Oh my god, this was so much easier with Wagyu. Ow! He's so heavy. So today we're gonna be talking about JJK. Okay. Now you know which one of my two dogs is easier to hold, but what you may not know is, well, a whole lot about JJK. See, JJK is one of the most, if not the most popular manga in the world right now. I believe this year it's third in manga sold in Japan, with only Blue Lock and One Piece ahead of it, which, you know, good company. And while JJK is known for its incredible fights and diverse characters with unique motivations, more than anything, it's known for being incredibly complex. And while there might be some anime fans out there who will try and shame you for not understanding JJK, don't listen to them. They're the worst. There's no shame in having absolutely no idea what's going on in JJK. I have to reread the last 10 chapters every time I read a new chapter so I can remember what exactly was going on. Even when I binge read it to catch up with everything, I had to go back multiple times to make sure I was understanding exactly what I was looking at. Now, obviously, things get easier to understand when the anime comes around, but we're in the final days of the manga here. We're in the last battle between some of the most powerful people in the universe. And yet, the motivations of certain characters are still kind of hazy. And this is one, because the bad guys in JJK are very confusing, and two, kind of by design. In fact, a large part of the allure of JJK is that usually we aren't privy to all the information. And nothing, and I mean nothing, is ever directly told to you. Pretty much all the concrete evidence we have from JJK is assumption. But an assumption in JJK is pretty much concrete evidence. You'll never hear Kenjaku has formed with Tengen. You'll just get an image of them together with Kenjaku talking to Tengen, and Tengen is nowhere to be found. This story will not hold your hand, at least when it comes to explanation. And while some people love that, it definitely loses others, which is where I step in, because it's a really good story. So I'll hold your hand, and we can weave through the complicated power systems, motivations, and character designs of JJK together. Now, in all honesty, today's video is supposed to be me sitting down and explaining to you exactly what's going on between Sukuna and Gojo. The domain expansion off. Explain to you how one was getting a leg up on another and what they were using to get said leg up on them with. Because if you say you understand what's going on in the manga by just reading it once, you're lying. Or you need to go outside more. I don't know. It's one or the other. But as I sat down to reread chapters 221 to the current chapter over for the 9th time, I got to the point before Sukuna and Gojo's fight when Kenjaku said he was going to go kill some Culligan Game members now that Gojo was occupied, which got me thinking, why would he want to do that? And then I kept pulling at that string until I realized I don't remember why the Culligan Game is happening. So I went back and I reread the manga from chapter 140-ish, and now I understand everything about the Culligan Game. Why it's happening, what Kenjaku's motivations are, what the end goal is, and most importantly, how it operates. And considering the fact that the Culligan Game is probably the most important thing that's ever happened in the JJK manga, it's a pretty good thing to understand. It's just like the 4th grade Shinobi World War. It's long, it's complicated, and we're not entirely sure where these long black-haired characters keep coming from. Which is why today, you and me are gonna have a long sit down and talk all things the Culligan Game. Because today, we're filming the Culligan Game Explained. But before we get to filming anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. If you don't, he'll lose all the bones in his body. Look, he's already doing it. And if you just love the idea of me talking about anime, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Doctors Anonymous, that I do every week with Danny Mata, where me and him break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, complications in anime. They can come from a myriad of different places. A character can have a complicated and involved backstory. A power system can have an incredibly complicated moveset that can be changed to fit any narrative. Or the motivations of some characters can not only be complicated, but also purposely kept in the dark. And JJK has all of that. The characters are complicated. The power system is individual and changes depending on the person you're talking about. And the motivations of some of the bad guys are straight up a mystery to a lot of us. And unfortunately, all three of these concepts come to form a massive amalgamation of confusion when talking about things like the Culligan Game, which has to do with Kenjaku's motivations for creating it, the history of how he made it possible, and how it's happening in the first place. I mean, with Kenjaku, we're talking about an entity that's been alive for at least 400 years and probably 1,000, who's been doing 1,000 years of work to make this exact Culligan Game a possibility. And yet now, where we are in the manga, Kenjaku is currently trying to end the Culligan Game. He's actively going out and trying to kill Culligan Game members to accelerate the ending of the thing that he spent 1,000 years creating. But Why? Why would he want to bring to an end a thing that he labored tremendously to start? Well, today we're going to try and answer all those questions and more, but before we do that, we're going to start this video off in the way that we tend to start these kinds of videos off. At the beginning. See, we all know that kenjaku is a sorcerer whose innate technique allows them to transfer their brain into other people's bodies. And these other people's bodies have been people like Noritoshi Kamo, who was once known as the most evil jujutsu sorcerer on Earth, and more recently, Tsuguro Geto. And the craziest part about this technique is once kenjaku's brain is transferred to a new body, they get to keep all of the memories and abilities and innate techniques of the person they've transferred to, which is why kenjaku currently has the memories and the abilities of Geto. Worse than this, Geto also gets to keep the memories and innate techniques of people he's previously inhabited, which is why to this day he still has gravity manipulation that he acquired from Yuji's mother. So by constantly switching from brain to brain, kenjaku has stayed alive much longer than he probably should have, which has given him hundreds, if not 1,000 years to lay a plan. But what is that plan? And more importantly, why is kenjaku trying to pursue it? See, kenjaku's motivations are somewhat unclear. Well, they're less unclear than they are kind of all over the place. See, the way that I would think about it is that kenjaku's motivations are threefold. That is to say that he has three kind of key things in mind. The first thing that kenjaku wants is to recreate the Heian era. See, kenjaku wants to refine cursed energy in Japan. He wants jujutsu sorcerers to exist at a level that they did 1,000 years ago in the golden age of jujutsu. The second thing that kenjaku wants to do kind of ties into the first one, and that is indoctrinate the entire world to cursed energy and merge them into one kind of hive mind. And by having the entire worlds merge together, get rid of the concept of individuality, blurring the line between humans existing and not existing. It's kind of complicated, I'll get into it in a second. Which leads us to the third motivation, that kenjaku wants to be able to control enough cursed energy that he's able to merge with the likes of Tengen, so long as Tengen has evolved, which is actually currently happening in the anime as we speak. At least Gojo's past arc is what's currently playing out in the anime. But simply knowing these three whys really doesn't help us with anything, because if we're being real, the three whys are incredibly complicated. So let's take a step backwards and focus on a micro scale on each and every single one of these wants, starting with the most obvious want to us, kenjaku's want to merge with Tengen, which he's actually probably already achieved. See, we know that Tengen has an innate technique of immortality, but that immortality doesn't come without aging, which means that Tengen every 500 years or so needs to merge with a star plasma vessel in order to restart the immortality train. However, because of a certain tight shirt, loose pants wearer, that doesn't happen, and thus the date for Tengen to merge with the star plasma vessel comes and goes, which leads Tengen to evolve. And while he is technically stable in this evolved form, he is evolved. Now, the problem with Tengen evolving is that they're no longer a human, really, if you could ever truly call Tengen a human in the first place. After Tengen evolves, they become more of a cursed spirit than anything. And the problem with Tengen evolving is that an unevolved Tengen can only merge with a star plasma vessel, which simply restarts immortality. However, should Tengen evolve, if somebody had enough cursed energy, they would be able to merge with Tengen. And since after Tengen evolved, it essentially became the world itself, the wrong person merging with Tengen could lead to a lot of repercussions. Now, as to what the world itself really means, we're not entirely sure. But we can speculate on what it means when we're trying to consider what kenjaku is trying to pull off. In essence, in a rare circumstance for JJK here, I think the answer is somewhat simple. After Tengen evolved, it became an extension of Earth, Gaia, the stone that Atlas is holding, becoming, in essence, Mother Nature, kind of. Tengen did, after all, start out as a woman. However, this is a somewhat dangerous concept, as an evolved Tengen is now not only a representation of the entire Earth, but also slowly but surely losing consciousness, which means that it can be ushered in really whatever direction you want. And considering the fact that Tengen was a non-combatant to start with, it's kind of a bad position to be in, which is why Tengen needed to be protected for a long time. All Tengen can really do is make very advanced barriers, and thus kenjaku wants to merge with Tengen, because once kenjaku merges with Tengen, it will create an entity not like anything we've ever seen before. The exact verbiage is something beyond a sorcerer. And this beyond a sorcerer would have the ability to possibly merge with the entirety of Japan, making them into an amalgamous hive mind entity that once again doesn't exist but also does. But kenjaku doesn't have enough cursed energy to merge with Tengen, which is why the Culligan Game is happening. Well, at least one of the reasons the Culligan Game is happening, as the Culligan Game has generated a massive amount of cursed energy that kenjaku was able to use to possibly, and more likely than and not merge with Tengen. Now, the reason that I'm saying that Kenjaku is probably already merged with Tengen is because in chapter 222, Kenjaku is talking out loud and says, I'm talking to you, Tengen, but Tengen is nowhere to be found. And now the last time that we saw Tengen, he had led Kenjaku to the mummified body of Sukuna and then kind of just existed in the fetal position in a tree, which kind of looked like Kenjaku's domain expansion. But I'd like to clarify the fact that I am moving forward with the assumption that Tengen and Kenjaku are already merged. But in order to better understand how the Culligan Game is going to generate Kenjaku cursed energy in the first place, we have to go back again and ask the question, how did Kenjaku fire up the Culligan Game in the first place? Well, he's had hundreds, if not 1,000 years. And in those hundreds, if not 1,000 years, Kenjaku has been meeting incredible sorcerers and offering to bring them back to life. What do I mean by that? Well, we learned from Kashimo that Kenjaku met Kashimo about 400 years ago. And Kenjaku offered Kashimo, who's the strongest sorcerer of his time and only wanted to fight against Sukuna, who was no longer around, that after his death, he would bring him back to life one day so we could battle against Sukuna. And thus, Kenjaku would take parts of these sorcerers' bodies and turn them into cursed objects, which he then fed to vessels a couple hundred years later, essentially marking them by forcing them to eat these cursed objects. And then when the Culligan Game was activated, these people who were forced to consume these cursed objects manifested the sorcerers who they consumed. But this wasn't even the only way that Kenjaku brought sorcerers into the fight, as Kenjaku also used Mahito's idol transfiguration ability that he got from fusing with Mahito to transfigure all people born with sorcerers' brains who weren't sorcerers and turn them into jujutsu sorcerers. Now, that sounds kind of complicated, so let me explain it in names that we understand. Junpei is an example of somebody who was born with the brain of a jujutsu sorcerer but didn't have jujutsu. And there's actually a lot of people like that in Japan. People with the brain chemistry to see cursed spirits, but not jujutsu sorcerers. And therefore, the moment the Culligan Game was activated, not only were a bunch of new sorcerers created, but also a bunch of old sorcerers came back. And all of these sorcerers were thrown into a massive battle royale. A battle royale with 8 rules, which I'm not going to bore you with currently, but more or less the most important rule is if you don't acquire any points for 19 days, you will have your jujutsu stripped from you, which kills you. It's called technique removal, and it kills you. And the only way to acquire points was to kill cursed spirits or other sorcerers. And thus, if you didn't do anything befitting of a jujutsu sorcerer for 19 days and acquired no points, you die, which forced every new and old sorcerer in the Culligan Game to kill each other, especially when you consider the fact that if you acquired 100 points, you could add a new rule. Now, technically, there's a deeper level to this conversation that Geto made binding contracts with all the sorcerers he brought back, but those were null and void once he switched over to Geto, but we don't need to explain that. It's too complicated, and honestly, it just gets nullified like that. It's barely worth explaining. And now that we have thousands of new sorcerers all across Japan battling against each other, Kenjaku has achieved essentially what he was looking for, which is the first reason that we talked about as to why he started the Culligan Game, recreating the Heian era. See, the Heian era in Japan was about 1,000 years ago, and that's when Sukuna was alive. That's also when all of the country's greatest jujutsu sorcerers came together to defeat Sukuna and cut off his fingers. Now, this era was known as the Golden Age of Jujutsu, which we learned from Kenjaku not only because there was so many jujutsu sorcerers, but also because they were so frequently locked in combat. And thus, because of the overcrowding of jujutsu sorcerers that all wanted to kill each other and kill cursed spirits, all of the jujutsu and the cursed energy in the country was heavily refined, and the cream of the crop was created, making an era where jujutsu sorcerers were undeniably the strongest they've ever been, which Kenjaku wants to bring back. But I know what you're saying.
Nick, why did Kenjaku only use idol transfiguration on those who had the brains of jujutsu sorcerers and those he force-fed cursed objects to?
Why wouldn't he just use idol transfiguration on the entirety of the populace of Japan and turn them all into jujutsu sorcerers or cursed spirits? Well, he can't do that. While it is technically possible to use idol transfiguration to awake the entire populace of Japan to cursed energy like that, Kenjaku doesn't have enough cursed energy, which once again is where the Culligan Game comes into play here. And that, in a sense, is Kenjaku's final goal. So you know how we said that Tengen evolved and became the world itself? See, if hypothetically Kenjaku was to merge with Tengen, he would merge with the world itself, and therefore would have enough cursed energy to do basically anything they want to, and would also be in constant contact with the entirety of the world. Now that's a problem because Kenjaku used maximum Uzumaki after absorbing Mahito, and since Mahito was over a semi-grade 1, that means that his innate technique was actually transferred to Kenjaku. But that was a lot of made-up words in a row, so let me explain to you what a maximum Uzumaki is. See, the maximum Uzumaki is the maximum application of Geto's cursed spirit manipulation. See, it combines a mass amount of spirits that Geto or Kenjaku has absorbed and turns them into one attack. It's a super condensed ball of cursed energy that can basically wipe anything off the map. However, using Maximum Uzumaki destroys all of the cursed spirits that you jam into it, which might sound wasteful. Why don't you pull out all of these cursed spirits individually and send them at your opponent? They won't be destroyed unless the opponent kills them. And while that might technically be true for a lot of the cursed spirits jammed into an Uzumaki, if the cursed spirit being used in a Maximum Uzumaki is a semi-grade 1 or over, their innate technique is actually transferred to Geto, which makes the Maximum Uzumaki an incredible way for Geto to get a bunch of new cool innate techniques that he can use whenever. And this Maximum Uzumaki is how Kenjaku activates the Culligan Game in the first place, because he needs Idle Transfiguration. But when you have Idle Transfiguration, that allows you to transfigure whatever you've touched, and you have merged with the world itself, that does maybe possibly mean that you should be able to transfigure the entire world, which in summation means that Kenjaku wanted to activate the Culligan Game so he could get enough cursed energy to merge with Tengen, so we could merge with Tengen, essentially merging with the world, so we could merge the entire world into one big amorphous ball, kind of like a Maximum Uzumaki actually. However, in order to do this, enough cursed energy has to be created by the Culligan Game, which Kenjaku kickstarts after the Shibuya incident. See, what Kenjaku did after the Shibuya incident to make sure the Culligan Game went off as a rousing hit was, by using the power of cursed spirit manipulation, release thousands of cursed spirits into the Shibuya ward. Now, since there are thousands of cursed spirits running around all 29 wards of Tokyo, there was chaos, and therefore there was a ton of cursed energy, because remember, cursed energy is released by stressed humans. Because if there's a bunch of entities that you can't see ripping you apart as you're looking for new manga in Akihabara, you're gonna get a little stressed out. And thus, this small release of a couple thousand cursed spirits actually ended up generating millions more, all of which filled the 10 barriers all along Japan, thus making sure that any new or old sorcerers had plenty of things to fight and kill and die to, which therefore allows them to refine their jujitsu and recreate the Heian era. Now, the reason that I'm explaining Kenjaku releasing all the cursed spirits into Shibuya is because it's important, and not just because it started the Culligan Game, but because on a macro scale, that's essentially exactly what Kenjaku is trying to achieve by forming the entirety of Japan into one big hive mind thing. See, all of the cursed energy in Japan not only refining itself but becoming more potent primes the entire Japanese populace for a grand merger, which, if you'll remember correctly, is the end goal of Kenjaku. And once enough of this cursed energy is created and enough of the populace is introduced to this cursed energy, Kenjaku, after merging with Tengen, can begin to merge the entire Japanese populace, erasing that line of individuality we talked about earlier. Now, Kenjaku is hoping that the general reception around this kind of incredibly scarring event will cause somewhat of a domino effect. See, Japan is not the end goal. The world is the end goal. And Kenjaku is hoping that the merger in Japan tips a domino to release a bunch of cursed energy elsewhere that allows the people of that area to be primed for a merger with the entity that is Japan, and so on and so forth. Kenjaku just knocking on the doors of every single country, terrified that the giant amorphous hive mind blob is going to take them over next. Ironically, just plays into the hands of Kenjaku, which answers the question of why did Kenjaku start the Culligan Game. Now let's work our way over to the how. Obviously, we understand that he was able to finally get his hands on Tengen and use Idle Transfiguration to create a bunch of barriers, then transfigure the people within those barriers to become Jujutsu sorcerers, and then fight all the cursed spirits that he either created or released. But pulling off that kind of Jujutsu technique is no small feat. So how is he able to pull off something so ridiculously impressive? Well, one, being able to tap into the barrier ability of Tengen is huge and should not be understated. But two, because Kenjaku had to make a numerous amount of binding vows revolving the Culligan Game to make it more powerful, with the most important those being that Kenjaku is not the game master, meaning that technically Kenjaku is not in charge. Now, can Kenjaku cheat to get exactly what he wants? Absolutely, but he's not technically in charge. And we don't know who the game master is. That hasn't been revealed yet. But what we do know is that killing Kenjaku will not stop the Culligan Game, which is an added benefit for him, at least, of him not being the game master. So now that we know how the Culligan Game was started, we should talk about what is it? Well, it's 10 barriers all along the archipelago of Japan. And within these 10 barriers, people have to kill in order to survive. It's a battle royale. Now, these 10 barriers popped up in important places all along the southern island of Japan, though not on the northern island, Hokkaido, because it's a religious area and also because of one of Tengen's barriers or something like that. And when these barriers first popped up, you had an option to either stay or leave, which actually strengthens these Culligan Game rules and barriers because people have the ability to leave. And what do we know about about domains. If there's a way out of the domain is stronger. So for the first however much time, I don't actually remember what it was, people were able to freely either leave or enter the Culligan Game. However, if you decided to stay in the Culligan Game, or you went to one of the barriers and joined the Culligan Game, you basically signed your own death certificate. See, the Culligan Game is called the Culligan Game for a good reason. One of the rules in the Culligan Game is that it doesn't end until all participants outside of Megami and Geto are dead. And if you're caught up with the manga, you'll know that Megami and Geto aren't really Megami and Geto. Now, technically, the Culligan Game isn't over until Megami and Geto are the only two people left standing rule was added later on. It is now a rule, and arguably the most important one. But adding rules to the Culligan Game is like a 30 to 40 chapter arc in JJK. And a lot of rules do get added. In fact, Hikari, Yuji, Panda, and Megami work together to gain 100 points so they can add a new rule. And that new rule is to allow for the transfer of points between people. And with this new rule added, people can simply transfer points to each other every 18 days to survive. So long as you've acquired points, you'll survive in the Culligan Game. You won't have your technique extracted and die. On top of this, they added the rule that if you have 100 points, you can leave the Culligan Game so long as you get a substitute. Which was a rule they created so they could get Megami's sister out of the Culligan Game. On top of this, Megami added a rule that those who are actively participating in the Culligan Game can leave the barrier. And Yurizu, who's an old sorcerer who took over somebody pretty close to Megami, added the rule that as of November 18th, 2018 or something like that, no new players can join, meaning that the entries to the Culligan Game are now done. So there will be no new additional members. So we now know the why, the how, and the what of the Culligan Game. But that was a lot of made up words in a somewhat jumbled fashion. So let me give you a summation of what the Culligan Game is, the TLDR, if you will. I've written it down. The reason that Kenjaku has started the Culligan Game is to refine all of the cursed energy in Japan, prime the population for a merger, recreate the Heian era, and create enough cursed energy to merge with Tengen. And after merging with Tengen and the rest of the Japanese populace, create a hive mind entity that has no individuality and has humans existing somewhere between not existing and existing as kind of an immersive blob of cursed energy. And then use the fear garnered by said blob to start a domino effect that allows this blob to take over the rest of the world country by country until the entire world is forcefully awakened to cursed energy and becomes essentially a worldwide cursed spirit. In order to achieve this, he used the maximum Uzumaki and Tengen's barrier abilities to create 10 barriers across Japan that people could either leave or enter for a little while. And if you were in these barriers and claimed yourself as a participant in the Culligan Game, you would have to kill either a cursed spirit or another sorcerer in 19 days, or you yourself would be killed. Or you would have to receive a transfer of points from somebody else. And this game only ends when the only two people left in the barriers are Sukuna and Kenjaku. Mind you, all of the most important characters in the manga have declared themselves as members of the Culligan Game, meaning that in order for the Culligan Game to end, technically, they have to die. And that is everything that you need to know about the Culligan Game. It's a lot. It's complicated. It's all over the map. And honestly, it could be 100% factually inaccurate. Kenjaku's methods and motivations change pretty much every day, but I think it's the most accurate summation I can put together. Now, considering the fact that I didn't fully understand how the Culligan Game operated until today when I did a little reading, there could be some inaccuracies in here, as there usually is when I make a JJK video, because making a 100% accurate JJK video is next to impossible. Well, it's definitely possible, but I post 5 videos a week, so gotta cut some corners. I'm also moving and sick. That's why I sound and look awful. But if this video has helped you understand JJK even a little bit better, tell me in the comments below. And if there's some inaccuracies, don't yell at me. I'm sensitive. Just tell me lightly, hey man, this is wrong. Look into that. Or, you know, send me a bottle of wine with a nice little note on it that says, hey, Geto actually doesn't have black hair. I don't know. But while you're down there in those comments, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I don't want to unpack everything in here so badly.